Time, 1908. The event, the Grand Prix of France. But these great racing cars and their daring drivers are about to take a back seat to a still greater racing event that same year. It was a New York City to Paris great automobile race. And the car that went around the world to win that race was the Buffalo-built Thomas Flyer motor car. On permanent display at the Hara Automobile Museum in Sparks, Nevada, it came back to Buffalo for a month-long display 81 years later, thanks to the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society and Rich Products. The location, Rich's Research Center on the city's west side, the one-time site of the E.R. Thomas Company plant, which manufactured the legendary motor car, as well as the World War I Curtiss Jenny trainer planes. Buffalonian George Schuster, a chief mechanic for Thomas, was behind the wheel at the finish line. He died in 1972 at the age of 99. So it isn't unusual to hear Jeff Maul recall some of the exciting accounts of that great race, as told to him by George Schuster, his great-grandfather.
There was an international team comprised of the American car, the German car, which was the Protos. That was manned by German military staff. There were 3 French cars and 1 Italian. These were the competitors that actually started, and only 3 of those finished the race.
All of the cars flew the American flag. This was provided by the American Automobile Association with the premise that the winning car would be able to return the flag to New York for a $1,000 prize at the end of the race. This is the Thomas as it looked on that day. It was a stock 1907 model, taken right off the floor of the New York City showroom. There was, of course, no time to modify it. As you can see, it didn't offer any of the amenities we take for granted today, windshields, roof. They were exposed to all of the elements. The car sold for $4,000. It measured 11 feet 8 inches long and weighed approximately 3,600 pounds. Its 4-cylinder, 60 horsepower engine was capable of doing 60 miles per hour. It would get roughly 10 miles to the gallon. Being chain drive, it required considerable maintenance in the drivetrain assembly.
I'm looking at the so-called fenders. Are those canvas fenders?
Yes, originally the car came with steel fenders. Those were removed shortly after the start of the race because of their weight. When they were transporting the vehicle from Seattle to Japan, part of the race course, the car was transported in the hold of a ship. Great-Gramp decided through the course of the voyage to go down and inspect the car, see how it was traveling, and he noticed at that time that all of the leather fenders were missing. And the captain said that he knew something was afoot because all of the coolies had new soles on their sandals. So the captain immediately directed the ship's sailmaker to produce the canvas fenders.
It was February 12th, 1908. This is the scene in Times Square. Some 250,000 New Yorkers turned out to view the start of the race. This is a scene shuffling off to Buffalo, New York, which was to take some 7 days. A blizzard started 20 miles outside of New York City with 2 feet of snow falling the night of February 12th. It took 10 hours to cover some 22 miles. This is a scene outside of Rochester, New York.
They would use the block and tackle to winch to the nearest tree. Well, not often were there trees available, so they would enlist the aid of either farmers and their teams, oftentimes hooking 6 to 8 horses at a time on the front of the Thomas to literally drag it through whatever predicament it found itself in. Crossing through Japan, of course, horses weren't that common. And there was one instance where they used that rope to actually climb a mountain. And there were some 45 coolies that actually took hold of the front rope and literally dragged the Thomas to the top of the peak. The backside of the mountain, the brakes would have never held, so the coolies then attached the rope to the rear of the car and lowered the Thomas down the backside of that mountain.
Am I looking at a seat belt? Now,
Yes.
come on, they didn't have seat belts in 1908.
Well, they didn't have seat belts until in 1908, until this race. The idea was to drive literally night and day without stopping. The seat belt at that time was installed to permit George Miller and my great-grandfather to rotate driving assignments. The idea of the belt was to literally strap them into the car so they wouldn't fall out while they were sleeping. Basically, the route was New York to Albany to Buffalo to Chicago, and probably the next major point would have been crossing through Tonopah, Nevada was quite a spot on the course. From there, they went through Death Valley on to San Francisco. From San Francisco, they loaded a steamer to Seattle, another steamer to Valdez. When they got to Valdez, of course, they found that it was quite impossible to navigate Alaska. They then returned to Seattle, shipped across the Pacific to Japan, crossed Japan, then crossed the Sea of Japan, entered Siberia in the area of Vladivostok, crossed through Siberia, Manchuria, Eastern Europe, about where Moscow is today, on through Berlin, down to Paris, and completed the race in Paris.
How many days?
It took 169 days to accomplish that course.
The American team entered Paris, France, July the 30th, 1908. Outside the city gates, a local gendarme stopped the car for routine inspection. It was here that the gendarme noticed that the driving lamp of the Thomas was broken and inoperative. Of course, local regulations required that any automobile in Paris had to have operative lamps. A local Parisian with a bicycle, overhearing the predicament, offered use of his bicycle lamp. Not being able to remove the lamp without considerable damage to the bicycle, the team lashed the bicycle onto the hood of the Thomas Flyer, and the Thomas drove into the city of Paris with a bicycle lashed to its hood. This was Saturday, August the 15th, 1908, and arrival in New York City. On Sunday, August 16th, there was a ticker tape parade to City Hall. It was then on to Sagamore Hill to meet then-President Teddy Roosevelt.
Yet 4 years later, the company's out of business. Now, it's hard to believe. Why did that happen?
Well, at the time that the Thomas was in production, there were relatively few companies, and they were all building relatively expensive cars. When Henry Ford introduced the Model T, which was a mass-produced car, sold for about 1/10 of what the Thomas sold for. That, of course, captured the American imagination. It was at that time then that with the mass-produced automobile that spelled the end for the Thomas Company.
But it will go down in history as one of the greatest.
Certainly will.